I still remember the exact moment I realized that Jess had broken into my room. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and I was lying on my mom's couch, half watching Netflix as a way to distract myself from the pain that made even a trip to the bathroom feel like my body might split open. With my high-risk pregnancy keeping me on strict bed rest, FaceTiming Jess to check on the apartment had become my only connection to the outside world. While she was laughing about some dating app mishap on her phone, I noticed a glimmer of silver reflecting off something behind her shoulder, a sight that set off alarm bells, especially when I remembered that my 75-inch TV, the one I had saved for 3 years to buy, was now mounted in the same living room she had promised she would never touch. Jess and I had been friends since middle school after her live-in boyfriend dumped her at the last minute and left her sleeping on a mutual friend's air mattress with nothing but a duffel bag of clothes. I had offered her not just a spare room, but the master bedroom. My apartment only had 2 bedrooms. I had been using the smaller one as an office, but I figured that after being blindsided like that, she needed the extra space. I convinced myself it was only temporary, just a few months at most. That decision would end up being the biggest mistake of my life. I spent nearly $5,000 from my savings furnishing the apartment when she moved in. A new couch, kitchenware, even blackout curtains for her room because she was always sensitive to light. The TV, though, was my pride and joy. I had picked it out during a Black Friday sale and hauled it up 3 flights of stairs with my then-boyfriend. I recalled how Jess had made a crude remark about the TV, as if it were some compensation for her lack of success in relationships, a comment that in hindsight should have been my first warning sign. But I brushed it off. After all, we'd been friends for over a decade. She had even driven me to the ER at 2 a.m. when I had my first gallbladder attack, and she knew my mom's chemotherapy schedule better than I did. I trusted her. Then the pattern began. Dishes would pile up in the sink for weeks while takeout containers acquired a fuzzy green crust. She would ask me for small amounts of money, a few dollars here for gas, and later larger sums for things like a vet bill when her sister's cat fell ill. The Venmo requests kept mounting and went unpaid. When the electric bill arrived, I caught her staring at her phone and complaining about delays with her paycheck. I ended up covering her share twice, convincing myself that she was just scrambling after the breakup. Then I found out I was pregnant. It hadn't been planned. The dad and I had already split amicably, but I had always wanted kids. Early on, my doctor warned me about complications such as placenta previa and the risk of hemorrhage. By 12 weeks, I was on modified bed rest. My mom pleaded with me to move back home so she could help, and although I agreed, I was desperate not to lose the apartment. Jess reassured me that she would take care of everything while I was away. I locked up my bedroom and bathroom, packed a suitcase of maternity clothes, and left her in charge of the rest of the apartment, trusting her assurances, even though something in them felt off. For the first month, everything appeared normal. Then, during a FaceTime call, I noticed the TV in the living room. My throat tightened as I thought back to all the promises made, and it struck me that something was very wrong. I asked her about it, and she just froze, a guilty twitch in her face that I had seen ever since we were teenagers, like the one she'd gotten when she once helped herself to my leftover birthday cake. She tried to explain that she needed something for a date and claimed she had returned it afterward, but her eyes told a different story. Reluctantly, I made her give me a tour of the apartment over the camera. When I looked around, I noticed that my bedroom door hung slightly open and that the wood around the deadbolt was splintered. It was clear she had used a butter knife to force it open. Inside, my clothes were strewn about and stretched as if she had tried every single outfit on, and the $200 serum I had diligently saved for was gone. Its bottle had been rinsed with water so that it appeared half full. Even more disheartening was finding my grandmother's jewelry box, something I had hidden in the back of my closet, now sitting on her nightstand. I didn't scream or cry. I just waited until I was certain she would be away, likely at her retail job, and then I called an Uber. I went back and retrieved everything: the TV, the jewelry, every plate and towel I'd ever bought. In her place, I left nothing but a bare mattress, a half-empty bottle of shampoo, and a note informing her that the utilities were now canceled and that she would have to handle the rest. Almost immediately after, I started receiving voicemails in which she questioned how I could just leave everything behind after all we'd been through. Her tone was unhinged and desperate. I ended up blocking her number. My mom urged me to stay calm, reminding me that stress was not good for the baby, but I found it impossible to sleep as I lay awake with one hand on my stomach, wondering if I had been too harsh. Although Jess had always been a bit of a mess, stealing from me was something I never imagined she would do, and I couldn't help but wonder if the breakup had really broken her that badly. Then, at 18 weeks, my water broke. The doctors couldn't stop the labor, and I held my daughter for what felt like an eternity, her tiny fingers curled delicately like little petals. Before taking her away, they allowed me a final moment to name her Emma, a gesture that only deepened the pain. 3 weeks later, I received a call from the landlord. Jess had trashed the apartment and vanished without a trace. The front door had been kicked in, and the walls bore the marks of violent damage. He even threatened to sue both of us for the extensive destruction since our names were on the lease. I drove over, still bleeding, and trudged through the wreckage. Her room reeked of a mixture of mildew and vodka, and the bathroom sink lay shattered on the floor. Under the bed, I discovered a single earring, one of my mom's from the 90s, with its matching pair nowhere to be found. Part of me wanted to believe that Jess had never intended for any of this to happen, that she had simply spiraled out of control after the breakup, after I left, losing grip on the narrative she had built around herself. But then I remembered the butter knife and the deliberate, patient twisting of metal until the lock gave way, and I couldn't shake the image of her standing in my closet, methodically picking through my things as if deciding what to take. My mom had advised me to let go of the guilt, reminding me that Jess was responsible for her own choices. Yet I continued to wonder if things might have turned out differently if I had given her one more chance. If, in some alternate timeline, Emma would still be here. Sometimes I questioned whether any of it truly mattered. The worst part was that I still missed her. Not the Jess who had betrayed me by stealing, but the one who used to hold my hair back when I threw up after prom. The one who used to sneak cupcakes into the hospital during my mom's treatments. In the end, I struggled to remember which version of her was real, and sometimes I wasn't even sure which version of myself was still genuine anymore. Now, for the first update. 3 weeks. That's how long it's been since I held my daughter. 3 weeks since the nurses had wrapped her in a blanket almost as small as a dish towel and let me trace the curve of her cheek with my thumb until it went cold. I didn't think anything could hollow me out more than that moment until the landlord showed up. He ambushed me outside the apartment while I was sifting through the wreckage left behind by Jess. I had gone back to salvage what I could. My mom's earrings and the few remaining clothes that hadn't been stained or stolen. The door was still ajar, with one hinge dangling like a broken limb. I hadn't heard him come up until he loomed over me. He informed me that I was liable for everything, thrusting a crumpled invoice at me with a total of $8,000, covering holes in the walls, a shattered sink, and carpet reeking of mildew. I tried to explain that I hadn't lived there for months and that Jess was the one who had ghosted me, but he simply shrugged and pointed out that my name was on the lease, insisting I needed to pay up or he would take both of us to court. I remember laughing, not because it was funny, but because the alternative was screaming. My savings were gone, spent on furniture, baby gear, and covering Jess's share of the rent. All that remained was the $1,200 my mom had slipped into my purse the night I came home from the hospital for the lawyer, her voice tight with the same forced optimism she had perfected during her chemotherapy years. The lawyer was a no-nonsense woman named Diane, whose presence reminded me of peppermints and regret. She skimmed through the lease agreement and then paused to point out that Jess had opened a water bill under my social security number. My stomach dropped because Jess and I had co-signed a phone plan years ago, back when she needed a responsible adult to vouch for her credit. I had completely forgotten about it until Diane showed me the credit report, which revealed $3,000 in collections from utilities I had never used. She then remarked that I would need to file a police report for identity theft, as if suggesting I should simply renew my driver's license. Filing that report felt like pressing a bruise. The officer took notes with the dismal enthusiasm of a DMV clerk, barely looking up when I mentioned the broken lock, the stolen jewelry, and the TV that Jess had pried out of my room. He assured me they would look into it, though his tone clearly suggested otherwise. I began obsessively checking Jess's Instagram, not with the intention of messaging her, since I had blocked her number after her 14th voicemail, but rather to see if she had posted any updates about a fresh start. For a while, nothing appeared, until one night I saw a blurry selfie of her in a car that I didn't recognize, with a caption alluding to a new city and a new self. By morning, it was deleted, but not before I had taken note of a faint reflection in the window, a highway sign pointing to a town 2 states over. The debt collectors were entirely indifferent to fresh starts. They called during my shifts at work, their voices laden with syrupy fake sympathy. One warned that escalating to wage garnishment was on the table, as if that were a favor. That same week, my boss cut my hours, citing performance issues, and I didn't even argue. How could I explain that I was so distracted by visions of my best friend laughing as she smashed the crib I had stored in my closet? I returned to the apartment one last time, hoping to find something, anything, to sell. And that's when I discovered the box. It had been shoved behind the water heater and was warped and reeking of mold. Inside were baby shower gifts, a knit blanket from my aunt, tiny socks still in their packaging, and a stuffed elephant with the name Emma stitched on its ear, complete with its tags still attached. I had never even opened most of them. A few days later, Jess's sister sent me a message. It appeared while I was scrolling through photos of Emma, whose face was so perfect it hurt. The message said that Jess was not doing well and was apparently couch surfing, and that I should know. Before I could reply, it disappeared, though not before I felt a stupid, traitorous pang in my chest. I imagined Jess sleeping in a stranger's living room, her car loaded with trash bags and the good knives she had stolen from my kitchen. Part of me secretly hoped she was miserable, even as another part of me recalled how she used to hold my hand during my first ultrasound, with a grin so wide that even the technician laughed. The landlord gave me 10 days to pay. I sold the TV first, the very one I had dragged back to my mom's garage. A college kid bought it for half its value, haggling as his girlfriend eyed my stomach. When he asked if I was really sure about parting with it, I said nothing. Next, I sold the jewelry, my grandma's pearls and the diamond studs from my 21st birthday. The pawn shop guy slid $900 across the counter, his face carefully blank. I kept Emma's things, the little hats, the blankets, and the ultrasound photos I had taped to my mom's fridge. Sometimes I would wake up from nightmares, images of Jess smearing my serum on her face or kicking in the nursery door, and then reach for the box hidden under the couch. My mom had suggested a support group, mentioning that there were ones specifically for loss, her eyes darting to the kitchen where my dad was scrubbing a pan too hard. But I couldn't do it. Sitting in a circle of strangers, all of us hollow-eyed and clutching tissues, felt like surrendering to a truth I wasn't ready to name. Then Jess's mom called. Her voice was raspy, as if she had been crying. She repeated that Jess was sick, emphasizing the word as if she were trying to convince me over and over again. I hung up while she was still pleading, my fingers shaking. The notion of sickness somehow seemed to excuse the fact that I had once hidden $500 emergency cash in my recipe book, the very one she had leafed through while house-sitting for me. And of course, that cash was gone by then, along with the book. Last night, I dreamt of Emma, not of the hospital or the quiet beeping of machines, but just her, swaddled in that familiar blanket with her eyes closed. When I awoke, the guilt had transformed into something different. It wasn't anger or grief, but perhaps resignation, or maybe survival. I don't know if karma exists or if Jess will ever apologize, nor do I know if I'll ever stop seeing her face in every crowded parking lot. But one thing is clear, I'm still here, however shaky and scarred, and for now, that has to be enough. Now for the second update. I've been bartending until 2 a.m. after my day job at the call center for 2 months now. 2 months of smelling like fry oil and cheap beer, counting tips in the parking lot while my mom sent texts warning that I was pushing myself too hard. Yet the landlord's deadline hit me like a grenade, and I couldn't let it go off. I bumped into Jess's ex, Mark, at a gas station off the highway. He was leaning against his truck, eyeing a pack of cigarettes as though they had personally insulted him. As I walked past, he casually mentioned that the Sunrise Motel, room 14, looked rough, and he warned me not to let anyone know he had said so. I froze, my hand tightening around the bag of ice I had just bought for the bar's cooler as he flicked his lighter with a trembling flame. So I drove right to the Sunrise Motel. Not because I had any real plan, but because the alternative was another night of staring at the ceiling while the sound of my daughter's heartbeat, a steady rhythmic whoosh they had let me record, haunted me. The place was one of those rundown motels where even the vending machines bore out-of-order signs older than I was. Jess's car sat crookedly in front of room 14, with the back seat crammed with trash bags and a stainless steel colander she'd helped herself to from our kitchen. Jess stumbled out as I approached, clutching a plastic bottle of vodka as if it were her lifeline. Her hair was matted, and the navy sweatshirt I once treasured, marked by a coffee stain on the sleeve, now hung off her frail frame. She accused me in a slurred and shaky manner, insisting that I had ruined her life first. The overwhelming stench of alcohol followed her in waves. I'd rehearsed this moment countless times, expecting a tirade of screams and accusations and finding some twisted satisfaction in watching her crumble. But standing there, I felt nothing but numbness. My phone, a precaution I adopted after the identity theft, was recording in my pocket. I calmly recounted everything, accusing her of trashing the apartment, stealing from me, and lying. Jess responded with a harsh laugh while swaying, insisting that I had abandoned her and that I'd known she couldn't handle the place on her own. For a brief moment, the bravado in her eyes gave way to panic, but then she quickly recovered, sneering as she declared that, if she could, she'd set it all ablaze again. Her threat lingered in the air, stark and undeniable. At first, the landlord didn't believe me. He examined the phone on his desk with a skeptical look as Jess's voice came through the speaker, restating her vow to burn everything down if given the chance. Once the recording ended, he let out a heavy sigh and explained that since court was expensive, if I chose to testify, he would hold her accountable instead of me. I could only nod, my throat too tight for words. Jess never showed up at the hearing. The judge, a woman known for her silver bob and cutting tone, ruled that Jess would have to pay $12,000 in damages. I felt a cold, thin relief wash over me. It wasn't really victory, more a temporary reprieve from impending doom. A week later, the $3,000 water bill mysteriously vanished from my credit report. My lawyer, Diane, forwarded an email that simply told me to check my score, and sure enough, it had jumped by 80 points. I remember sitting in my car outside Target, overwhelmed by tears until an employee tapped on my window to see if I was all right. The next day, I moved into a modest studio apartment. It had peeling linoleum and a window that rattled in the wind, yet at least the locks were solid. I hung Emma's ultrasound photo by the window, letting the morning light filter through the grainy image. That first night, I ordered Chinese food and sat cross-legged on the floor, the silence so profound I could still hear the hum of the fridge. Later, Jess's mom sent me an email with a subject urging me to read it, though I almost ignored it. Her words were measured and pleading, as she explained that Jess had been hospitalized after a breakdown and wasn't stable. Even though she admitted it didn't change anything, her message made it clear just how much Jess was suffering. I ended up deleting the email and emptying my trash folder, feeling that forgiveness was a burden far too heavy to bear. While cleaning out my old purse, I discovered a pawn shop ticket taped to a gum wrapper. The address was all too familiar, a grimy downtown storefront where I recalled the clerk giving my grandma's necklace a suspicious glance when I'd sold my earrings. It turned out Jess had pawned the necklace for $150. I pulled out the last of my tips and bought it back, and the chain felt colder than I remembered. About a month later, the landlord sent a text saying that Jess had sent $500 before disappearing without a trace, leaving him done with chasing after her. I didn't bother replying. That night, I gathered up the clothes Jess had left behind, band tees, leggings, even a faded bikini, and donated them to a shelter, keeping only the hoodie she'd taken from me. It still carried the lingering scent of fabric softener and vanilla perfume, and I ended up wearing it to bed for weeks. My mom expressed her worry during Sunday pancakes, remarking that holding on to anger was like drinking poison. I lost my temper and challenged her, asking if she could forgive someone who traded a child's memory for money from vodka. Those harsh words hung between us, and she didn't say anything in reply. These days, I eat dinner alone most nights, sometimes even setting two places at the table just to break the silence. The studio's walls are bare except for the ultrasound photo and a cheap frame holding my grandma's necklace. I keep telling myself that the justice I secured, the cleared debt, the dropped lease, and that recording of Jess's threat was enough. But in truth, I don't really know what enough looks like anymore. Maybe it's the absence of new disasters, or waking up without dread coiled in my chest, or simply knowing that wherever Jess is, she can't take anything more from me. Now the hoodie is tucked away in a drawer and the ultrasound still hangs by the window, and I'm still here. Now for the final update. 6 months have passed since I last posted. The days blurred into a rhythm of work, therapy, and learning how to breathe without feeling like I was drowning. Promotions and credit scores don't heal grief, but they do make the practical parts of existing a little easier. I saw Jess outside the grocery store first. She was sitting on a flattened cardboard box, her hair tangled into a nest, her hands cupped around a crumpled paper cup. Our eyes met for a split second. Hers widened before darting away. I walked past with a tight chest, but halfway to my car, I turned back, bought a sandwich, a bottle of water, and a banana, and left them beside her without a word. She didn't look up, yet her fingers curled around the bag like it was something fragile. A week later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox without a return address. Inside were $200 in cash and a note scrawled on the back of a receipt. The note apologized and admitted that its writer had loved her as well. I donated the money to a prenatal care nonprofit, specifying that it be used for high-risk mothers. The email confirmation even mentioned that Emma's name had been added to their memorial garden. I ended up crying in the library parking lot where no one could hear. Later, the landlord sent me a photo of the renovated apartment. Fresh paint, new floors, sunlight pouring into what once had been my bedroom. He mentioned that there was no trace of us. Although the new tenants had invited me to see it, I declined, deciding that some ghosts are better left undisturbed. On a Tuesday, Jess's mom called with a tired, thin voice that suggested she'd been crying. She explained that Jess was in rehab, adding that the kindness I had shown her by leaving a meal had helped her realize that she needed help. I looked at the ultrasound photo that had been taped to my fridge, one that I had taken down and put back up a dozen times, and told her I was glad that Jess was safe, though I said it quickly and ended the call before anything more could be said. That night, I unblocked Jess's number. 3 months later, she texted me saying that she was sober and intended to pay me back with no excuses. We later met at a diner with sticky vinyl booths and coffee that tasted like burnt toast. At the table, she handed me an envelope containing $300, mostly in ones and fives, and I noticed that the sleeves of her top revealed bandages on her wrists. She admitted that she was trying, and while I forgave her, believing that the weight of my anger outweighed the grief, I also made it clear that I couldn't be her friend. Overwhelmed, she broke down and admitted that she felt undeserving, and I let it be. The final of the landlord's fees was paid off using my tax refund. When the confirmation email arrived, I sat on the floor of my studio and laughed until it turned into sobbing. Not from sadness exactly, but more from the relief of feeling like a bone had finally snapped back into place. I planted a tree in the park near my apartment, choosing a maple because it's stubborn enough to survive the harsh winters here. The small plaque only bears the name Emma. Sometimes I later find dandelions tucked among its roots, or a pebble placed carefully at its base, signs that strangers have taken care of it when I wasn't around. And that is enough. I later heard from Mark, Jess's ex, that she was working at the rehab center now, mentoring others and wearing those 2 big sweaters she always loved. I still have her hoodie, though I donated the ultrasound photo to a group that creates memory quilts for grieving mothers. It felt like passing a baton in some small way. I decided to take a pottery class, something I always wanted to try, even though Jess would typically dismiss such hobbies as self-care nonsense. My first attempt at a vase was lopsided, with the clay collapsing under my nervous hands. However, the instructor explained that it wasn't about the final product, but about feeling the weight of the clay, watching the spin of the wheel, and embracing the process. Now I go every Thursday, sometimes just sitting and centering the mound over and over, feeling the grit under my nails. I still have nightmares, though they're quieter now. They're less about broken things and more about the fear of forgetting her face. When I wake up, the silence isn't empty anymore. It's simply still, like the air after a storm. I don't know if justice exists, but I do have a tree in the park bearing my daughter's name, a vase on my windowsill, and a hoodie folded in my drawer that no longer smells like vanilla. Jess is alive. So am I. Perhaps that's all the closure we're ever going to get.